All right, guys. We live in an asynchronous world which is full of events. Think about you place an order in your favorite online shop, or think about a plane is being delayed, or think about the truck which holds your orders leaving the logistics centrum and is then placing the order at your home. But why is it that we still treat those asynchronous events way different than we treat the well-known REST synchronous world? Today, we are talking about a new approach of dealing with those event-driven APIs, combining the best of both tech worlds, of REST and of the asynchronous way of communicating, and making it very simple and very easy to reuse those APIs in an enterprise. My name is Benjamin. I'm working for a company named Solace. We are building products all around event-driven architecture, and most lately built a new product called Event Portal, which helps enterprises to reuse APIs in an event-driven way, and also is based on AsyncAPI for export and import capabilities. To myself, I'm based on, does anybody know which this city is in Germany? Any idea? Berlin? No, not Berlin? Also not Frankfurt? Munich, yeah, perfect, exactly. Yeah, I'm based in Munich, and I work for Solace since 1 year. Before that, I was working for a customer of Solace, which is the IT company behind Lidl, so the Schwarz Group, which is also a heavy adopter of AsyncAPI in a lot of different use cases. And yeah, in my new role, I'm helping companies to leverage events, leverage asynchronous APIs, and build new use cases based on that. So enough about Solace, enough about me. Let's talk about the agenda I had. We'll talk the challenge which we see a lot in different enterprises when it comes to asynchronous event-driven communication, which I call the point-to-point mess. Then we talk about a possible solution, which is the unified API management, combining the REST world with the asynchronous world. And lastly, we talk about an implementation we saw at customers of us to increase the reusability, especially of async APIs. So, PubSub can still lead to a point-to-point mess. Gartner advises us to think event native. Gartner says, hey guys, the world is changing so fast. If you think synchronous, you're lost, right? So you need to think events, and you need to be event native. What does that mean? That means you put your event in the center of your whole application infrastructure in your IT environment, and build everything around it. So if something happens, you can easily react on this event and do something on it. So a particular example would be an order being placed. The logistics system might need to react on this order, the warehouse system, for example, but also another domain is involved, like the customer relationship management, which needs to know, aha, this guy just ordered a new pair of jeans, so the next coupon will be not jeans, because he has them already, so maybe I will offer them something else, right? Maybe a nice shirt. And that's what Gartner says, and I would say I would agree. So I'm a big friend of event-driven APIs and making this possible in an asynchronous way. But still, there is the need for some kind of synchronous interaction, especially if it comes to end-user related interfaces. And that's what we see a lot. And I like the idea of Fran that AsyncAPI is becoming also more adoptable in the REST world, because that's the reality we see at our customers. They use REST a lot for synchronous interactions, for example, in a user interface. So I buy something at my favorite online shop, and I immediately get the return, yes, Benjamin, we got your order. We will notify you if anything changes, right? But then on the back end, an async API is being used to send events to different participants, to different domains, and those will then notify once something has changed, and then I, as a customer, get the notification, yes, your order is now ready to be shipped, or later on, your order would be ready to be picked up in your delivery store. So that's something we really see a lot right now, is the combination of REST APIs and asynchronous APIs in different use cases. For example, also the online shop use case, but also different other use cases where you would need some kind of direct feedback, direct interaction in terms of your user interface. So we talked about the benefits of events. We talked about that they're mostly connected also in some way with REST APIs. And I want to talk now about a thing we forget sometimes to talk about, and this is even if you use pub/sub, so even if you use a publish and subscribe pattern, you have one event and you have multiple consumers to consume it, this can lead to a point-to-point logical dependency in your overall infrastructure and overall application architecture. And why is that? This is because on the one hand side, we see the lack of a flexible way to consume just the events you want to consume. So sometimes you see just implementations which are not fine granularly consumable, so you just have orders. But I just want to have the orders for this country, I just want to have the orders for this user, I would just want to have very fine granularly. So you have a huge generic approach which really lacks in reusability, and then mostly will lead in the fact that the consumer of the API will require another API being built so that they just get the things you need. Another thing, and this is something I just want to really encourage everybody on, is the description of the event itself. So an order can mean in a business so many different things. You know, there are orders which are relevant for the online shop, there are orders which are relevant for some back-end systems. So it's very, very important to map the technical order to the business element and to make it as transparent as possible within the organization so that the API can be reused. And the last thing is what can lead to such a point-to-point mess, that you might have high entry barriers to get to those events. So it's not easy to consume an async API. It's hard. You maybe have manual interactions with someone who's responsible for that in that certain team. And then they build their stuff themselves again, and then you have duplicate events in your infrastructure. So that's also something we saw. Before taking this whole onboarding cycle, they just said, okay, let's just republish another type of order, and then we will take this one. And then they had 3 or 5 different orders in their system, but they're all in the end the same business object, which we don't want to have. This is one of the reasons why a lot of application architectures we see, they kind of look like this. So everybody is, pushing and pulling, and if one is pulling harder, then things go to this side and then to this side. But it's not a community approach, and it's definitely not a self-service approach. And it's definitely very hard and complex to manage and to evolve over time. So that's something we want to change. But how would we change this? We would like to change this with reusable event APIs. That's the reason why we are all here, which present the actual business logic in their API, such as what kind of order, how does it, which subtype of order is it, and so on. We want to make it easy to just consume the events which are of interest. So not to have this big pot of events. I need to get all the orders and then I need to filter out by myself. So I just want to get, for example, orders for Spain. Another thing we want to encourage is we want to use async APIs alongside synchronous APIs, because that's what we see a lot of enterprises are doing. And very important, make the access very easily possible so that APIs can be reused. And when we do this, we might be there. We have APIs everywhere. You look anywhere, you have an API. There's another API. And I read a sentence, let's put an API on your API so we have an API for our API user, right? That's not what we want to do. So how to manage this? How can we ensure that this is still structured and still not leading to an API chaos? And this is where the unified API management comes in place. The idea of the unified API management is to, on the one hand side, manage REST APIs exactly the same as you would manage asynchronous APIs, in terms of tooling, in terms of workflow, etc. And on the other hand side, the idea of unified API management is to, by that, increase the reusability. So I know some companies, they have some incentives for their APIs if they're being reused a lot, right? So that dev teams, they're getting some kind of incentive if they build APIs which are being reused a lot, and the same thing we want to achieve with event APIs or asynchronous APIs. Before we get to the solution, again, another thing I'd like to put a little bit in context. So we call this the API patterns evolution. We started with a quite REST-based world where everything was REST calls. You have a lot of, request-reply scenarios, etc. Then we went over to hybrid REST events, which is the fact that you have a REST API in front, but behind this REST API you speak events, right? You exchange your asynchronous events. And what we think when we talk about event APIs is that you might have a REST API interface for your REST API use cases where you need it, but you have also asynchronous APIs in your backend, which can be called directly also from other domains. So for example, let's stay with this online shopping use case. You might have a REST API in front to place the order. And then you have a lot of different systems behind, which are all working with async APIs. So for example, the warehouse system would also get this order via an async API, but another system could also push another event via an async API directly, so they are not forced to walk through this REST world. And that's what, when I talk about event APIs, what I think about event APIs. So there can be some REST part in it, some synchronous REST part, but most importantly, it's based on async API. Who will find the async API or event-driven APIs the fastest? Raise your hand, please, on this Gartner hype cycle for APIs. Who finds it? Event APIs? Event-driven APIs?
Expectations, no?
Sorry?
They are in the peak of inflated expectations.
Exactly. Innovation trigger. They're between the innovation trigger and peak of inflated expectations. So I think it's a good timing to talk about event APIs in general, and I really look forward to see how async API is going to emerge and is going to progress during the next years, because Gartner says event-driven APIs, the plateau of their hype will be reached in 5 to 10 years. So we are still at a kind of a starting point, but what I can tell you from our point at Solace is that a lot of big enterprises, such as Lidl, but also other large companies, are always working on a daily basis with asynchronous API to increase the reusability of event APIs. So, another thing which I would like to introduce is thinking about event APIs as we think about REST, a way that we treat them as products. Meaning we bundle different capabilities, meaning we have some kind of, product owner, API product owner of that API, which can manage it and helps to develop it further. But most importantly, we would encourage to build API products which contain synchronous and REST, asynchronous and REST APIs in one product, as I spoke before, and treat them as products, and treat them really exactly the same way as developers out there already working with REST-based APIs. And how is that? Everybody out there has an API gateway, which is exposing the API during the runtime and is decoupling the backend from the front end or the backend from the API consumer. And on top of that, they have an API portal, right? So they have some way of cataloging things, documenting things, discover things, share and reuse, and finally also generate code out of that if they want to do that. And we want to introduce a similar approach for events. So as you know, with Async API, every company has their event broker of their choice in place, using it to communicate with their different systems. But there was nothing on top of that. There was nothing similar to an API management, API portal approach, which is something we would highly encourage to think about. So to have something like an event portal. So to have something where all your events are displayed, you have an event catalog, which is based on async APIs, of course, and where it's easily for your developers to jump in, just grab the stuff they need, maybe also working via CLI, consume those defined APIs, reuse them, and make more out of them. And that's, based on async API. So to match those two worlds. And if then async APIs also be more REST-driven, you can erase the open API on this slide, right? So we would just need async API. All right, and then from a top-level point of view, how could this look like? So the idea is really to have all these things together in one place so that you are able to discover and audit your asynchronous APIs, all your topics, your schemas, etc. But also that you have a capability or have a point where you can design the things. Because what we also saw is that, of course, we as developers, we love to be in code, we love to be working with CLIs or working in a schema. But there are also other players around an enterprise, like an architect or maybe even, I don't know, product owner, manager, and they love to see things visually. They love to see, okay, this app is sending something to these consumers. So that's something we would also like to think about, so make it visual in a way. And then lastly, to have a real event API management in place for the whole release management, creating the API products, and making them accessible via the API management, which might be already in place at a company. So for example, via Apigee or via Xway or via Kong or any API management which is in place. Or also a marketplace, for example, like Backstage, where you then have your asynchronous APIs together with your synchronous APIs in one API product. That's about the idea of unified API management. Just to summarize it again, treat event APIs as a combination of synchronous and asynchronous APIs, build API products, and think them in the enterprise really the same way, and integrate them in your maybe already existing synchronous API management landscape with an API portal, API management, etc. Now I want to quickly showcase an implementation which is done by the event portal, which my employer provides based on Async API, and which shows a little bit how this helps to reuse events. And before we do that, I tried to write down just 4 general tips which came through my mind during lots of customers' interactions, how to increase reusability of event APIs. And the first one is, it's very easy to write it down, but it's hard to manage it actually, or to make it happen. Keep APIs as simple and self-explanatory as possible. It's a tough one, because simple is always, from your perspective, something is simple. From another mind's perspective, something is very complex. But still, that's from my perspective the key to make the most out of your data and to increase the reusability. Another one is to allow flexibility on the consumer side. So you might want to allow the consumer just to get a subset of the events. So not the whole topic, not all orders, but just the orders from Spain, or just the orders from Germany, or whatever. So to make it very flexible so that they can benefit from that. Another one is that describing the business context and the ownership in a catalog and a portal. As I said, this will help a lot to increase the reusability as people know what kind of order this is and can make more out of it. And last but not least, build self-services and automated workflows around it so that you have a way lower entry barrier into the asynchronous world, so that it's quite similar to the synchronous world, and it's just a joy to use, right? Oh, there's a new event API, let's go, I use it, I like it, right? So that's a little bit of mindset we try to create. Let's have a short look into one possible implementation. In this case, we have this event portal which contains the API definition and the API product. And from there, by using the Async API spec and using the Async API exporter from the event portal, we can easily generate, via the Async API code generator, for example, Spring Cloud Streams project, which gives you already a head start, right? So it's just 3 clicks, and your developers can consume events which are built beforehand via Async API and reuse them as they need them. And how would this look like in real world? So this is, for example, a snapshot out of the event portal. You see a publisher, this is the position system, it's a retail use case. The publisher is publishing sales orders, and you have 3 consuming systems, in this case SAP Finance, Data Warehouse, and Stock Management. And behind this graphical user interface, of course, you have an async API. And you can even get this async API by using an IDE plugin, so you can have it directly where you want to have it. And from there, you export the async API and can generate code out of it and easily reuse this specification without a high entry barrier or without very complex thing of how to get to that information. The benefits are at hand, I think. So this way of treating event APIs as REST APIs in a unified API management will help to increase innovation, will lead to better reusability and decreased dev cycles, and will have solutions in place which definitely fulfill the customer's satisfaction. So they will help to build resilience and real-time based use cases, which we all are love to use, right? So like a real-time update of an order, etc. All right, just to summarize it again, just to have an async API in place is already great. I would like to encourage to think a little bit further, to treat them similar as REST APIs with products, to make them visible in some kind of API portal, to have an automated delivery and workflow behind that, and then to leverage this information and increase reusability by making more out of your data and making more out of your events. That's all from me. I don't know if we still have time for questions. I would love to answer some questions. If you want, we can also talk about real-world use cases from customers of us using async API. So yeah, there's one.
You guys get to enjoy my voice today. That's amazing. Benjamin, you said that our world is an event-driven world, right?
Yes.
And in some sense, I'm a computer scientist, and I think all we try to do is to model the world into systems, into ones and zeros. So my question to you is if our world is an event-driven world, what's the problem with us gradually rolling out REST APIs and focusing like entirely on asynchronous APIs?
It's really hard to understand on the stage.
Man, I'm really sorry. So
I can
my question is essentially, why is it a problem?
Yeah.
Like, what's the issue? Like, what could possibly go wrong with us gradually rolling out or phasing out synchronous APIs,
yeah.
REST,
yeah.
and focusing entirely on asynchronous? Why do we have to manage both, like, in the same system? Is there a problem with us, like, gradually, like, phasing out synchronous APIs and focusing on asynchronous APIs?
Okay. So is the question about why do we even need synchronous APIs while we are living in an asynchronous world? Is that a question? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I really like it. So if you ask me, we just need asynchronous APIs because I love asynchronous APIs, right? But the thing is, there are some advantages of synchronous APIs, which we currently, with async API, I would say, try to also get to in the event-driven world, which is, for example, the ease of usability. If you ask a developer, they would easily say, yeah, for me, it's easy to just consume a REST API. I know how it works. It's straightforward. It's REST. I don't need a client library. I can just go ahead, right? And there are some things where REST APIs are great in, and that's especially querying data. So getting data from something where data is already stored, for example, with GraphQL, or also to have a very straightforward request-reply scenario where you need directly the response. And if you don't get a response, the transaction would fail. So think of your order, you place it in the online shop, you only want to get a notification that the order has been placed if this really happened, and this has to be happening in some kind of timeout way. So you cannot just wait for an asynchronous event in that way. So I think that's the reason why REST APIs still have their point for querying data, but also for those synchronous use cases, which are synchronous, where you want to have direct feedback. But the larger integration world, which is, taking this event and routing it to different consuming systems to react on it, which is then asynchronous, of course, is getting bigger and bigger over time. Yeah. Any other question?
Great talks. Thanks for that. My question is related to the unification. So you unified the operational aspect of APIs. Do you see something also on the design part from your customers? Do we even speak about an unified approach to API design? Because when we hear API design, we always think about REST.
Yep.
Do you have this kind of concerns from your customers?
To deal also with asynchronous APIs during design time?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So one thing we did not speak about is the whole thing about mindset in a company. And our customers which have approached a certain level of maturity of async API, they were pain in the ass for their developers. So they did internal conferences just talking about asynchronous APIs. They said, guys, think about async API first. These are good use cases for async APIs, etc. So to try to get them to a point where they start thinking of it directly before design time even, right? So that they say, okay, yeah, this is something we will do with an asynchronous API. Nevertheless, there will always be an synchronous API which would be better in the hands of async API. So this is something we also see, which then is rather being refactored later on, or stays the same and they decide to change it over the way. The thing I try to bring in this message is really that it should not make a difference. So it should not make a difference for the developer going left or right, you know, whatever left or right is. It's just an API. So I really like the fact that Async API tries to become also more connected with the synchronous world, as this will help us to then in the design time make this even easier for the developers. Yeah. Right, hope that answered the question, and thank you for the question. Yeah, great. Okay, I'm here still the afternoon, so if you want to discuss some use cases or deep dive, I would really love to. And thanks again for the time, and enjoy the event. Thank you, guys.